When I was a kid, I always loved when my parents took me to my grandma's house. Grandma Patty was absolutely amazing. She was sweet, funny, loud, and we used to have such a great time together. When I visited Grandma, she always was very carefree and, well, she let me do whatever I wanted to do. I could eat whatever I wanted and watch whatever I wanted and play whenever I wanted to. And without a doubt, Grandma used to spoil me so much. But not in a bad way. Grandma Patty was just, a better grandma than all the rest. Now, I knew without a doubt that I was Grandma's favorite. Even though I was the youngest one of all her grandkids, I was the one who spent the most time with her. Most of my cousins were also close to her, but I like to think the difference between them and I is that, I used to cherish my time with my grandma. Many kids don't really appreciate their families until they're all gone, to be honest. And I wasn't one of them. I'd already lost one of my aunts when I was around 5, and at that age I learned that you have to show love to people while they're alive because, once they're dead, they're already gone. And that's why Grandma Patty was so important to me. And even though I was a little boy, I already knew how life worked. Grandma wasn't the youngest anymore. In fact, she was 78 years old and her health was not the best, so I wanted to spend as much time as I could with her. When I was a little boy, I used to visit my grandma every other weekend, and she would also look after me whenever my parents had to work or go somewhere else where they couldn't take me. However, when I was around 4 years old, my parents took me to Grandma's more often because both of them had full-time jobs, so Grandma used to look after me 2 or 3 days a week, depending on how good she felt. And by the time I was 8, going to Grandma's was a routine and pretty much my second home, to be honest. And in a strange way, I considered my own house my second home and Grandma's house my main home. I just loved to spend time with Grandma, and I knew I wasn't the only boy who actually thinks their grandma's house was better looking than their parents' house. It makes sense that Grandma's house looked better. After all, she lived longer, she knows better, and quite honestly, a lot of grandparents had more money to spend in comparison to their children because they didn't need to spend so much money on others anymore. But, the point is, her house was absolutely gorgeous. Her house was big and picturesque. It looked like the size of a real doll's house. The walls were covered in beautiful flower wallpaper. The wooden floor was always warm. The windows had a different shape in comparison to most windows. In fact, they had a circular shape rather than the classic square one. And last but not least, Grandma loved vintage decoration. Her house looked like a little antique shop that you would find hidden in an alley in town. Grandma loved to collect things, and this includes figures, porcelain, and especially dolls. Grandma had a full room of dolls, from porcelain ones to rag dolls, and from Cabbage Patch to Barbies. Grandma's collection was huge. Grandma always let me and my cousins play in her doll room. Now, yes, I was a little boy, but at the time, there wasn't really too much else to do there. And so I did play with my cousins with the dolls. And we were always allowed to play with them whenever we wanted. And of course, she always told us to be careful with the porcelain dolls, for she loved them very dearly. I was always such a good kid, and was very careful with things, especially if they were not mine, unlike my cousins. And twice they broke a couple of Grandma's porcelain dolls, so she banned them from touching her porcelain dolls ever again. Especially Anita. Anita was my grandma's favorite doll. She was a beautiful porcelain doll that was, without a doubt, very, very old. I would go as far to say ancient. Despite not being a modern doll, Anita was perfectly well made. She looked strong, shiny, and clean all the time. She had perfect light brown hair and loose pin-up waves. Her skin was pale, and she had lovely rosy cheeks. She had big amethyst eyes with very large eyelashes. Normally, she had beautiful long pink skirt, a white Victorian-style blouse, and cream ballerina shoes. But definitely, one of the best things about her was her flexibility. Other vintage dolls were stiff. Anita, despite looking like many other vintage dolls, well, she could be moved into different positions. Nevertheless, Grandma was the only one allowed to change Anita's position. In fact, she was the only one allowed to touch her at all. Anita was, without a doubt, special to Grandma, so we didn't question Grandma's decision, and to be honest, it was very understandable. When you got something very important to you, you wouldn't like anybody messing with it, let alone kids who have a tendency to destroy things. Anita was not in the same room as the other dolls. She was always in Grandma's room, next to her bed. Often, when I spent the night at Grandma's, I would stare at Anita as I tried to sleep. Her skin was so shiny, it almost looked like a lamp. I don't know what was the thing about Anita, but she scared me, yet she made me very curious. There was just something about her that was intriguing for a doll, and I used to feel as if it were watching me, as if it were conscious. Now, Grandma's health was not the greatest, but one day, it became worse. She had to be hospitalized, but despite the efforts, it was not enough, and, well, my grandma passed away. My parents didn't tell me straight away. On Tuesday evening, we went to Grandma's house, and once we were there, they told me what had happened. Obviously, I was devastated. My grandma, who was technically my best friend and companion, was gone. I cried for some time until eventually I decided to grab Anita the doll. And I ran to Grandma's room, but surprisingly, when I got there, I couldn't find Anita. I looked everywhere for her, but nothing. I called Mom and she helped me look for her, but we couldn't find her. Throwing tantrums and crying for no reason was not very me, but I did it that night. I was so frustrated. I wanted Anita. I wanted my grandma alive, but I wanted her doll. It was a part of her, and I wanted to find her before my cousins did. Mom and Dad tried looking for her in the doll's room, but they didn't see her, and Mom told me to grab other dolls from that room, but I absolutely refused. I just wanted Anita. And eventually Dad convinced me to grab some of the other dolls, and well, I did. When my parents and I got home, and we went to put the dolls in my room, Mom entered the room first, for I was still afraid of the dark. All those tears wasted, Mom told me. What do you mean? I asked her with a croaky voice. Mom pointed to my bed, and I turned quickly to see what she meant when I saw Anita laying on my pillow. I don't know how she got there, Mom, I said as more tears ran down my face. You must have brought her with the other things Grandma gave you permission to bring a week ago. No way. Grandma never let us play with Anita. I think she came here on her own, Mom. I wept. Then, I don't know. Look, it's been a rough day, and everything that's going on is very sad, but there's no reason to imagine things. Maybe you just forgot she was here. Okay? The important thing is that she's here. Let's call it a night. Go to bed. My mom told me as she hugged me tight, obviously frustrated with me. Afterwards, she tucked me into bed with Anita by my side. Mom turned off the light, but she did put on my lamp like always. And then she was headed towards the door, but before she closed it, I asked her, Mom, did you ever get to play with Anita? No, never. Grandma got her when I was no longer living there. In fact, she got her when Auntie Anne passed away. Now, good night, sweetheart, she said as she closed the door. Holding Anita felt very surreal. I always wanted to sleep with her and hold her tight, but Grandma never let me. I was also very intrigued. Even though Mom was right and Grandma did let me take some dolls and cute things home before she went to the hospital, I never grabbed Anita. After all, she was off limits. I put Anita in front of my face and started staring at her. And once again, she gave me that sensation that she was going to wink or stare back at me at any time. Although she didn't. Days later, it was Grandma's funeral. The reception was very beautiful, and my parents had Grandma cremated. When we came back home a few hours later, my parents' room was a giant mess. My parents decided to yell at me because, well, I was the last one in the room. The bed had been unmade and the pillows and blankets were all over the place, and I was surprised. I wasn't responsible for this. The only thing I had done in their room was watching the Powderpuff Girls before going to Grandma's funeral, but of course my parents didn't believe me. I was told to make their bed and to clean their room, and in the meantime, my parents went downstairs. Now I started to clean. Approximately 2 minutes into cleaning, as I picked up a pillow, I saw Anita. And at first, I got scared. But then I started to think that maybe I had her with me when I was watching TV. And after a few minutes, I finished organizing their bed and went back to my room. Now, 2 days later, I was playing in my room, and all of a sudden, I heard some screams. I rushed downstairs to see if Mom was okay. And once I got to the living room, I found Mom crying. I asked her what happened, and at that moment, Mom did something she never did before. She struck me. "How could you?" she cried and wailed. I was utterly confused and started crying as well. Then I looked around and saw why she freaked out. Grandma's urn had been opened, and her ashes were spilled all over the carpet. Laying on top of the ashes was, well, Anita. Mom desperately got on her knees trying to put the ashes back in the urn. And at that moment, well, Dad got home and ordered me to go to my room and not come out. It was all too weird. It was the third time something strange related to Anita had happened, and at that moment, I knew I was right. There was definitely something mysterious about this doll. I was in my room for 2 hours. It was already dinner time, but my parents didn't call me. I was very upset about everything that had happened, and to be honest, well, I was also afraid. I was sitting on my bed looking at Anita, waiting for her to react or just do something. And during 2 hours, I didn't take my eyes away from her until eventually I got what I asked for. Anita turned her head towards me. I screamed and ran away from my room as soon as I could. And my parents came to see what was going on. It's Anita, it was her. She's the one that's been doing all these things. She's alive. She moved her head. I yelled it at the top of my lungs. Dad went to my room and said that Anita wasn't even there. I was so afraid I didn't even want to go back to my room. And I could tell my parents were looking at each other in just utter disbelief. They let me stay in the living room for a little bit. Then we had dinner, but both of them were very quiet the whole entire time. And when it was time to go to bed, I begged them to let me sleep with them, but they said no. Dolls are not alive. Go to bed, they said. You have nothing to be afraid of. But I was. I didn't know where Anita was. But I knew that when she came back, she would do something bad. I spent 20 minutes in my room, but I felt so uneasy. Not knowing where Anita was hiding was making me a nervous wreck. I quietly exited my room and headed to the living room. I noticed the living room door was open, and I could hear my parents speaking, so I decided not to enter and stayed behind the door listening to what they were saying. She definitely got it from Mom. I knew it was going to happen sooner or later. I knew Mom told her that goddamn doll was alive. Damn it. And now my kid has this crazy idea and is hallucinating, seeing things, doing things, and blaming a doll. She could develop some sort of mental illness. We need to put a stop to this. I heard my mom telling my dad. And at that moment, everything made sense. Anita was indeed alive, but I couldn't tell my parents anything. I went back to my room and looked everywhere, but nothing. And I tried to stay awake as long as I could, but eventually sleep got to me. Hours later, I was still sleeping. I felt something on my chest. I opened my eyes just to find Anita walking on me. She had a creepy look on her face, and she laughed creepily and moved slowly. I grabbed her with both my hands, put her in the pillowcase, and she kept moving like a trapped kitten, but I managed to take her to the kitchen where I planned to burn her by using the stove. And I started burning her, but I was just a kid, and the fire got out of control. And the fire alarm started sounding, and my parents came down. Dad immediately tried to stop the fire and was successful. However, they asked me what I was doing, and I told them the truth. They told me I needed to see a psychologist. There was nothing I could do, but I was happy that Anita was finally gone. After that, they took me to therapy for 1.5 years. I cooperated and told them it had all been part of my imagination because it's what they wanted to hear. But I knew the truth. Years later, many years later, I asked my mom about the doll, Grandma, and other things. And Mom explained to me that Grandma claimed the doll got to her house a week after Aunt Anne had died. Grandma always claimed the doll could move on her own and even speak. So Grandma used to believe the doll had the spirit of my aunt. It made sense why Grandma kept the doll despite being haunted. However, Grandma was wrong. That spirit couldn't have been Aunt Anne. My aunt was a lovely, sweet woman. And the spirit had to be something much more sinister. Well, the good thing is that whoever it was or whatever it was, it's gone now.